Okay, so I'm just going to say this just off the bat because I know people are going to wonder. This has nothing to do with the review. It has absolutely nothing to do with Mastodon. Yes, I am very aware that Porcupine Tree is releasing a new album next year, and no, I will not be listening to any of the singles leading up to it. I want to listen to the album when it is released next year with a clean slate. I don't want to have any preconceived notions of what this thing is going to sound like. So there you go. Just a blanketed statement right off the get-go, because I know I'm going to get a lot of questions about that in my comments down below. So yeah, with that being said, now let's talk about Mastodon. Hushed and Grim by Mastodon. So Mastodon, it's another one of those bands that I feel like they don't really need an introduction. They got their start in the early 2000s, really kind of plunked their flag into this more stoner metal, grunge, sludge metal outfit, and just like blew apart the scene in being a lot more thought-provoking, a lot more deeper concepts. Like pretty much all of their albums up to The Hunter in 2011 was a concept of such, dealing with either a literary masters of, Moby Dick, or a essence of reality. And then once we got to The Hunter in 2011 and in the 2010s, each album kind of still had a relative concept going on there in terms of like how they were going to approach the music in that sense. It worked to a certain extent, depending on who you ask. I've loved their entire discography. I still hold true that Mastodon has not put out a bad album. There are albums that are definitely better than others, but each album of theirs is absolutely stellar, and you can't go wrong with any of their releases. I love the quirkiness of Once More Around the Sun. I love the heavy griminess of The Hunter. I love the more dredgy ambient sounds of The Emperor of Sand, and then just the mind screws that are their earlier works from Crack the Sky, Blood Mountain, Leviathan, and Remission. When it came to Hushed and Grim, I can't say that I wasn't excited about it, especially with their last EP of Cold Dark Places, which still to this day is one of my absolute favorite works from them. Like, it's only 4 tracks, but still the emotion that they were able to capture off of that was just breathtaking. So now we come to Hushed and Grim, their first double-length album, which is really saying something. Like, one thing that I loved about Mastodon was they were able to say such a complex, interweaving, multi-layered stance and statement in a very concise and short runtime. Like, very few of their albums went past the 50-minute mark, but this one more than excels in that one. We're getting into like the 80 and 90-minute runtime, so it is their first full-length double album. What we get is a lot of music. So before I dive right into the music itself, I want to do something a little bit different and talk a little bit about the technical side of this album, which is something I don't really do on a lot of my reviews. This album is being produced by David, and I'm going to try this last name. Oh boy, here we go. Bottrill, I think it is. Bottrill. David Bottrill. And for those of you that don't know, David has been behind the scenes for a lot of staple and prominent albums, from Peter Gabriel's So and Us, King Crimson's Vroom and Thrack, Tool's Enema, Rush's remix of Vapor Trails that was put out in 2013, which really, like, taking the mess that was the original Vapor Trails and really polishing it up into that 2013 mix was just brilliant. But you also have like Muse's Origins of Symmetry, parts of Dream Theater's Scenes from a Memory, not the whole album, just bits and pieces from here and there. Between the Buried in Me's Parallax Hypersleep Dialogue, so the like EP that went out before Parallax Part 2. Coheed and Cambria's God's Apollo. I mean, the dude has been around and he's done so many, as I mentioned, prominent and paramount albums that really help shape and define music going forward. And his fingerprints are definitely smattered all over this. Like, you can definitely feel like there's a master behind the mixing board and producing this album just to a T. And each of the albums that Mastodon's put out up to now have been a concept either loosely or really like tightly. This one kind of follows that in a very loose concept dealing with death, what that death means for the departed as well as those left behind, how we deal with it. And a lot of this kind of stemmed from Nick John, the band's manager, up to 2018 when he unfortunately passed away. They did a EP for him, which was Stairway to Heaven for Nick John. And it was all right. It was all right. But like you can feel that essence, like the concept of death, the concept of what is life in the context of the inevitability of death. And that's seen a lot throughout this. There's this metaphor of what comes after, the growth of that. You know, it's almost like this body that's been buried into a tree, and the tree itself is now taking on a life of its own. And in fact, in the album artwork, you can see a very good likeness of Nick in the trunk of the tree, and I'm pretty sure that wasn't by accident. And the music itself definitely follows suit with this. This is probably Mastodon's most haunted album, and that includes Cold Dark Places, which itself is very haunting. It's very menacing. At times it's very mesmerizing and hypnotizing in that sense. I'm really loving the darker haunted overtones of this. I was listening to this album all throughout the holiday Halloween weekend, and it fit the mark perfectly for that atmosphere and that overtones. It's darker, it's grimier. It's not quite as gritty as some of their past albums, especially from the past. Like we're looking at like their first 4 albums, but definitely has that darker overtones across the entire album. And while we're talking about the music, I also want to talk about the vocalizations and the singing styles on here, because we do have those 3 vocalists on here. We've got Bran Daller, I'm going to try to pronounce all these names. I'm probably going to miss most of them. Brent Hines, as well as Troy Sanders. The only one that doesn't lead the vocals is Brett Killier, which kind of makes sense. I mean, the dude's just on the rhythm guitar. He's got a lot to think about. But all 3 of them have a moment either to shine or harmonize with one another, to the point where tracks like The Beast and Piece of Tranquility see all 3 of these individuals not only taking center stage, but harmonizing across one another. So we get these beautiful and luscious 3-part harmonies we don't really see in the stoner sludge metal landscapes at all. Like most of the time it's either just like a growl, we're growling, or a yelling, we're yelling. And sometimes, I mean, this was the introduction of Bran finally taking the lead vocals every once in a while with more of like a clean singing styles. This is carried through on this album. Bran has a lot more time to utilize his clean vocal works, but this still allows Brett and Troy to allow that more guttural, more yelling, more harsh vocals. So all 3 are able to really utilize their skills and harmonize with one another using whatever skill they are of master of. And of course, how can you talk about Mastodon without talking about the guitar works? As always, Brent Hines has several moments to take that lead guitar center stage. The group really allows him the space to provide a beautiful and meaty guitar lick on pretty much each of the tracks. Like most of the tracks have a really amazing guitar solo, if not some really tasty guitar melodies through there. But a major props needs to be given to Bill Killier for his rhythm guitar works. Like he and Troy Sanders on the bass work provide a perfect foundation that then elevates Brett's center stage playing to take place. All 3 are doing a brilliant job of kind of elevating each other's work. I'm really digging Bill's rhythm guitars on this one. His rhythm guitars really provides that foundation that provides this hypnotic, almost mesmerizing soundscapes. Like it feels like you're in this ethereal transient state of not quite dead, not quite alive. You're just kind of in this limbo state that provides this haunted environment for everybody to play around. That then allows for Troy, for his bass work, to really provide more of that bottom of these tracks. And it's just a great blending of all the musicians overall. And the last thing that I wanted to touch upon before I go more in depth in terms of the track works on here is the keyboards that are on this. I mean, the band has played with keyboards in the past, but never to the amount that it has been found on this album. There are a lot of moments where the keyboards actually take center stage. We're looking at More Than I Could Chew, which has more of like a hushed atmospheric blending towards it. There are moments on Eyes of the Serpent, which opens up the track very similarly to Weakness from Opus Damnation on there. I'm loving some of the more sci-fi eerie qualities from like the 1950s, 1960s sci-fi films that we saw on like Pushing of the Tides, as well as Tear Drinker, although on Tear Drinker, it might actually be like this overlaid dub sound effect on the guitar works, as well as Gobblers of Dread, and I'm loving that great atmosphere that plays very, very well with the bass work that's being laid down on this track. But probably my favorite moment on this is Skeleton of Splendor. Very, very like Richard Wright from Pink Floyd. Like, it's definitely a Floyd inspired keyboard work. I'm getting flavors of like Any Color You Want or Any Color You Wish from like Dark Side of the Moon. It's just so piercing while still being this very trippy, very atmospheric, very acid rock soundscapes. And all of these are being provided by Joan Nangara, and I'm really hoping I'm pronouncing that one correctly. He's coming to us from the Claypool Lennon Beryllium, as well as Stone Giant. So the guy has been around, and his keyboard work is just splendid. I wouldn't be surprised to see him credited as like an official member of the band and albums coming in the future, especially if Mastodon wants to continue this sound that they're starting with this one. So I've been kind of, beating around the bush a little bit when it comes to the actual music on here. Let's talk about the tracks. Let's talk about the music. The music on here, I feel, can be kind of split into one of two camps. Either very hard-hitting, very aggressive, the usual tankard of Mastodon, as well as some more mellow tracks, a little bit more atmospheric, a little bit more haunting. On the hard-hitting tracks, we have tracks like the opening half of this album, like Pain with an Anchor, The Crux, Sickle and Peace. All these are very bombastic, very chugging. I'm loving how the album opens up with those first two tracks of Pain with an Anchor, and The Crux opens up with this massive explosion of sound. Bran on the drums, he really solidifies himself as being a master behind the kit. Talking about drum works, just a little bit of an aside, I'm loving more of those ritualistic drummings that we found from Dagger. It's very mesmerizing, and it almost has this Middle Eastern flair, and it's actually being provided by Dave White, or Witt. So I wanted to kind of put that out there, because at first I'm like, man, Brandis really stretches his legs, until I realized that it was a different person altogether. But I'm loving that soundscapes that are on there. Like, it really showcases the experimentation that's going on this album. Some other amazingly hard-hitting tracks we have on here is like The More I Can Chew, Pushing of the Tides, which I feel is one of the more quintessential Mastodon tracks on here. Like, if you think of like what is a Mastodon track, I really feel like Pushing the Tides is definitely one of those tracks, as well as Savage Lands, which is one of my favorite tracks off of here. Again, it starts off ridiculously hard with Bran on the drums just exploding the work. It's relentless in terms of being like this chuggy, almost locomotive that can't stop. Like, the momentum that is carried between this like freight car is ridiculous. But then by the midpoint, it begins to transform and transition into a little bit more of this melodic, very atmospheric track that allows for a brilliant build-up that creates this plateau for those guitars, those swelling guitars, to take center stage and really blossom into this soundscapes of brilliance. And speaking of this, like, a lot of tracks do take their time and build, like Peace and Tranquility. The first half is very hard hitting, very in your face, very bombastic, but then by the second half, it pulls itself back a little bit and becomes this more ethereal, almost untangible track. And it's very similar to like this sudden departure of an individual that you thought was there, and then they're gone. And so, speaking of like, those are the hard-hitting tracks, we have a lot more of those more melodic, more mellow tracks. I already touched upon Skeleton of Splendor, which is, again, one of my favorite tracks based on that just brilliant, high-soaring synth work that's on there. But we're also talking about Had It All, with an amazing guitar solo by Kim Thyrell, I think, the guitarist from Soundgarden. His presence on this fits like a glove. At times, it sounds very similar to the essence of Mastodon, while still having a little bit of that Soundgarden taste on it. Another one that's a little bit more on the mellow side that has a guest appearance is The Beast, that opens up with Marcus King. And Marcus comes from a more bluesy, even like country and western background, which is quite fitting as, you know, some of the history of some of the individuals of the band of Mastodon do have that kind of flavor to them. So that actually fits in very well. It might sound a little off kilter at first, but once you come into the overall concept of the album, it fits very, very well. I've already touched upon Peace and Tranquility in terms of being the second half of that track, the first half being very bombastic, but the second half being a little bit more tranquil and a little bit more on the peaceful side. So I love that like transitions, as well as one of the latter tracks of Eyes of the Serpent. Again, very ethereal, very hypnotic. It feels like you're entering into this trance. I'm loving the sway and the flair of it. And I've already mentioned a lot about the different builds that are on this album. Like Tear Drinker just starts off very rhythmic and bouncy with a great bass anchoring the song down, but then near the latter half of the track it really like explodes into this chunky guitar solo. Same with the Savage Lands, that starts off very heavy on bombastic, but then as the track continues it becomes a little bit more somber, a little bit more personal, that ends with one hell of a guitar solo. And I've already mentioned a little bit of Gobblers of Dreads, but it makes sense that this track definitely has great builds, great ebbs and flows, as it is the longest track off of this album and the third last track. So in the runtime of this, it's great to have such a amazing ebb and flow track that still grounds the album into this engaging listen. You know, it starts off very mellow and haunting, that then flows right into the second last track of Eyes of the Serpent. It starts very mellow and it builds itself into this great crescendo, and it really blooms itself into the second half of the track. We've got a lot more of those haunting vocalizations, a lot more of those haunting singing styles that lead us to the end of the track that really brings this all together. And I would be absolutely remiss if I didn't touch upon that last track of Gargantuan, my favorite track off of this album, and honestly probably my favorite track that Mastodon has ever done. This track just bleeds emotion. There's so much raw energy off of this. Like, it starts off with that swell of drumming from Bran that really catapults this track. It's so raw, it's so tangible of being this like gritty of a track where the chorus and the verses in that first half kind of trade back and forth, where one does the same as the other. I'm loving the use of like the different soundscapes that we have on here that then present itself into the second half of this track, that just the transition is so silky smooth that it elevates that second half. You know, it's that catapult, and the lyrics on this is just it's heart-wrenching with like the lyrics of like those last lyrics of "My love so strong, detecting the thoughts of strangers to reach the other side. My love so strong, the mountains we made in the distance, those will stay with us." And the harmonizations that we have on this, the added vocal works of that just provides the perfect harmonizations between the music and the other lyrics that are going on it, and that final guitar solo just soars so beautifully. I couldn't help but just love it, and I get myself so emotional with this track. Like, I remember going into the record store and picking this up on the Friday that it was released, and they were playing this track, and I had to like take a moment for myself because I was getting emotional. I was like, just give me a second, guys, just 1 second, I'll give you my money, and just jeez, man. I can see this album being a little much for people, and I get it. You know, one of my biggest criticisms of progressive rock over the past decade is like bands really need to learn how to shorten their album lengths. Unless there's a reason for an album to be more than 45-50 minutes, an album shouldn't be more than 45 and 50 minutes. But Mastodon proves that if you have enough to say, if you have enough music to back it up, if you can justify a long runtime, then please go for it. And I feel like Mastodon does that on this album. They more than justify the runtime, because that large cathartic release by the time we get to Gargantuan is so grand that I can't help but feel emotional. It's one of those tracks where I just close my eyes and let the music wash over me because of how grand it is. Again, Gargantuan is a perfect moniker for that track and the perfect endpoint for this album. So yeah, this album surprised surprised me beyond measure. You know, like I knew that I was in for a treat after Cold Dark Places, but I didn't really anticipate how much of a step forward the music would be on this album. I have not been able to listen to anything else over the entire weekend, and each time I listen to it, the album gets better and better and better. I keep thinking maybe this will be the moment where the album doesn't hit me the same way, or I'm not really enjoying where I'm at. But honestly, each time I sit down and listen to the album, I enjoy it even more, which is really saying something for the runtime and the investment they have to put into it. As I mentioned, this album isn't for everybody. You know, I can see a lot of people not necessarily liking the runtime of this new direction that the band is going into. It's definitely one of their more somber albums, but it also has a lot of teeth on this album as well. They did a very good job of the placement of the tracks on here, so we don't get a very long stretch of tracks that are mellow or a very long stretch of tracks that are very harsh and grimy. We get a good balance of each within the runtime, so that by the time you're starting to get too hypnotic, we've got a punch in the face. And by the time we're like, okay, I've got enough, we get a couple of mellow tracks to kind of help us out in that sense. So for my final rating, I have to say Hushed and Grim by Mastodon is an absolute masterpiece.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
I gotta do it. I gotta do it, you know, like I have to honor a masterclass work of art, you know, an album that has moved me to the extent that this album has. I can't give it anything less than a masterpiece because each track hits so incredibly hard. And when you've got 15 tracks to play through and there's no single dud across that runtime, I gotta praise it, you know, I gotta do it. So yeah, absolute masterpiece. And it really goes to show that if you had told me at the beginning of the year that 3 legacy bands of like Dream Theater, Between the Buried and Me, and Mastodon had been putting out albums, and it was Mastodon that I loved the most out of all those, I would have been like, okay, and here we are. I'm like, all right. So yeah, absolutely gets the note seal of approval. This is one that I highly recommend. I think this is a perfect starting point if you haven't already gotten into Mastodon, because I think it does a great summarization of everywhere the band has been, as well as a perfect look into the future of where the band is probably going to go. Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at for this one. That's kind of where I'm at. Where are you at with this? Trying to talk through a burp. Where are you at with this album? Do you love it? Do you hate it? I can see both sides, you know, but I am firmly in the camp of loving this album. But let me know of your own thoughts by commenting down below. And if you like what you see and you want to help support me, support this, head on over to my Patreon. I've left the link down below. That's patreon.com/notesreviews. Even $1 a month goes quite a long way. You get shout outs on all of my live streams. You get your name at the end credits. And depending on the rate that you donate at, you get little thank you videos in a album review or 2 or 3 or a worst to best, depending on your rate. So yeah. That's all I've got. That's all I've got for Hushed and Grim from Mastodon, and I'm going to close it off there. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.